I'm Brett Cooper, and this is the Frontline Mobility Edge, where we discuss the latest in mobile device technologies and how they're shaping the frontline landscape of business. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Blue Fletch Frontline Mobility Edge. Today, we're joined by Tony Belisch from Zebra. He is an executive sales engineer in the healthcare group, so been doing it for quite a while. And this podcast is based on an outline that Tony and a number of folks from his team did. Lee and I sat through this last month in Lincolnshire, which is Zebra's head office, where they covered a number of their lessons learned or experiences. And it was a presentation called The 5 Phases of the Clinic Mobility Solution, which, and I told Tony and a couple other folks in his team, this is probably one of the better presentations I sat through in the last couple of years. It was both strategic on one side and pragmatic on the other. So it's definitely a lot of insights combined with lessons and experience, which was, for me, I walked away with a lot of takeaways. So wanted to walk through, I'll do a high level of the 5 areas, repeat what I took away from it. And then Lee and I had questions for Tony that we were going to dive into. So we'll go ahead and get started. I guess, Lee, before I hop into anything else you had to add color to the your takeaways?
I would say just Tony and his team you could tell they put a lot of team effort and time into this. So in Lincolnshire in December, when they put it on, it was 4 of them. You could tell that it was a lot of thought and a lot of experience. So I think this is going to be super valuable.
Awesome. So we'll start with the first one, which was solution to the first phase of delivering or providing a clinical mobility solution, which was solution discovery and design. You guys talked about doing a lot of work up front, looking at what are the pain points, what are the actual requirements from both a technical and operational side, and thinking through how do you capture those, how do you get feedback into them. And then, Tony, you guys talked about some of the pitfalls, but I guess from your experiences for projects you've worked on, how often do you see discovery go well? And then are there certain things that you run into, you're like, we got to do better, organizations need to do better on the discovery phase around these 1 or 2 things? Anything that stood out to you?
Absolutely. So from my experience and certainly the experience of my colleagues as well, we've seen some deployments that have gone very, very well, that have been very successful. Obviously, there's always going to be, just your road bumps along the way, because nothing ever goes perfect. But and then we've had some other ones that haven't gone so well, that have been very forced, and just a lot of time spent troubleshooting, going back and reworking things, just having not happy clinicians at the end. And so that's where we think that this solution discovery, the workflow design stage, is very, very important. Is bringing in the people who are actually going to be using the devices that you're deploying. And so again, when I've seen IT departments just make a decision of, this is the device we're going to use, this is the software we're going to use, and they just put it in the nurse's hands and just send them off to start using it, those typically are not a good way to start. The nurses, they just never feel like they're getting, their input is not being regarded. And so sitting down at the solution discovery and workflow design stage and actually working with the people who will be using the devices and the software, the people who will be managing the devices and the software, bringing them all together, establishing a project manager, establishing a project owner, and then that's what we would do in this stage, and even getting so far as to start picking the MDM that's going to be used if there's not already one, and start making some decisions about those things before we actually put a device in anybody's hands.
And Tony, from your perspective, would you say going into a project like this, are most organizations accepting of the reality that they need to put a lot of team effort and a lot of time and man hours against a project in order to get it work? Or do you think that typically the expectation is, we picked our device, this is our software, these are our users, we're just going to deploy it?
So I see both. And again, the ones that do realize the scope of the project, the complexity of the project, because in situations, for instance, where they have just a phone today, that literally is just a phone, that all you can do is make phone calls with it. now you're putting an Android device in that person's hands, which has a lot more capabilities and you can do a lot more stuff with it. And if you don't lock down that device, then the people will do stuff with it. And then you end up with a bunch of devices that are in all sorts of different states and it just becomes unmanageable. So again, at this initial stage is where we want to start scoping those things. And certainly the organization has to have the realization of just the complexity of the deployment and start putting time frames around things that are realistic, which would include things like just budgeting for time, IT's time, making sure that the nurses are aligned, informatics if there's an informatics department at the hospital, just getting everybody involved and making sure that everybody understands what their part of the project is going to be.
Follow up one of the things that I think you guys called this out during your previous presentation about just change management processes and governance. I know I've been in projects where IT started something and then all of a sudden the legal or HR or somebody showed up and they're like, "What are you guys doing?" And I feel like in a clinical environment, this is even more important. Do you have any pro tips around how to involve or pull in governance earlier when like you said, IT might be trying to just push some things out the door?
So again, yeah, I think that's where the just identifying the project manager, identifying the project owner, and just starting to bring in the project manager should be talking to all those different departments to see if they have any concerns, any input. Certainly in some deployments that we've done, the IT security department is completely separate from the mobile engineering department. And so you get so far down the road, and then security steps in and says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, you can't do that on my network." And so then, now we're having to go back and retrofit certificates and things, and which is just not a lot of fun. And it becomes very time consuming to go back and do that after the fact. So that's where I would start, defining the scope of the project, because we want to contain scope creep. And you certainly want to have a change management process, though, if we do need to change things, if we need to add to the project. But this is absolutely where we want to define exactly what is going to be in this deployment, and try to contain it to make it ideally as simple as possible, because then we can always come back and add things, add features, add software, all those sorts of things after the fact, once we've got a successful deployment.
Mhm.
That scope creep item you just called out, I think that's super underrepresented on how a lot of people think about this discovery phase. I feel like um, some of my favorite project managers to work with are those that are very hard line on, we draw a line, everything beneath the line is not in scope. And I feel like too many organizations I've worked with want to do everything up front. Um, I guess, one of the sense I got out of the presentation I saw is that you guys try to push very hard on containing that scope. Do you have any guidance or thoughts on how to do that, or how to really get people to focus on the core pieces as opposed to all the other added value they could do?
Sure. Again, just having a strong project manager is, key to that, and having defined what the scope is. And, then it would be up to that project manager to make sure that we do stay within the defined scope of the project. And then you've got the project owner that we can go to, if we need to have a judge on anything that, can make the determination whether or not we need to add to the scope, or just keep within the boundaries that were set from the beginning.
I like that title, judge. Your role as judge, arbiter. You're the arbiter of scope.
Sure, sure, we'll say the arbiter.
You see somebody who's a LinkedIn title as arbiter of scope,
Right.
not project manager. We're gonna move on to the second area that you guys talked about, which is the staging, provisioning, and enrollment. So you have, you've gotten you define done your discovery, define what the project looks like, define what scope you're going to have. The next phase you guys started talking about was thinking about how you take these mobility devices, set them up, provision, enroll. I feel like a lot of times this is an afterthought for a lot of people. They'll just put software on a device, go test it, and then won't think about these other pieces as part of their pilot initial testing. But for you, when you think about that, staging, provisioning, setup, configuration, enrollment as the second phase after discovery, what are the things you try to start getting organizations you work with to do during that phase?
So certainly the MDM is a very, very critical piece of all of this. And so, some organizations are already going to have an MDM and you just have to work with what they've got. Sometimes at this stage is, when they're looking to actually select an MDM. And that's where you want to make sure that the MDM is going to be able to do everything that you need it to do, or start working on what your alternatives are. And for instance, is it going to, allow you to automatically update applications if you want applications to automatically update? What if you don't want them to automatically update because you don't want versions just rolling overnight and now all of a sudden you wake up and things are broken? So, those are things to consider here, and to make sure that your management system can do what you want it to do, or find an alternative. Another one is operating system updates. So I've actually had some customers that their MDM was not capable of pushing operating system updates. And nobody really thinks about that at this initial, staging and provisioning stage, because we don't need to do an operating system update now. We'll just stay with whatever version is on there. Well, the fact of the matter is at some point in the future, you do have to update, because either your applications are going to support that old version, or there is some new feature that you need, or there's some new security protocol that you need, and you will have to do an operating system update. So you want to make sure at this point, not only that you can do an operating system update, but that you figured out how to do that you actually got that process in place, so that when we get in that situation where we need to push it out, we're not having to figure everything out at that time. So, just having that plan in place. And then just also at this stage is where you want to start thinking about, like, how am I going to lock down the device? Do I want to, things as simple as just like the volumes on the device. If it's a phone, do you want your staff to be able to put it to do not disturb mode? Do you want them to be able to put it to a no ring mute mode? Because if it's a phone and the phone call's coming in from, a doctor and it's critical, or the charge nurse and is trying to call a nurse, then, you don't want it to be on mute. And so those are the kind of things that you can consider here. And certainly, working with your Zebra sales engineer, or your, value added reseller, we can figure out, how to get those settings the way that you want them, and then what applications is the staff going to have access to. There's things that we can do, like there's a flashlight app, so you may not want them to be able to pull down the settings and turn on the flashlight, but we could provide you with an app that would allow you to use the device as a flashlight, and just put that icon on the screen, while taking away, all the other icons that they don't need and shouldn't have access to.
I love the EMM, like making sure you know what it can and can't do before you start. I've definitely seen that, or OS upgrades are not included. Lee, did you have any questions or thoughts around the staging and provisioning and other pieces there?
Yeah, I think some other parts of that too is staging and provisioning. Tony, to what extent do like multiple sites come into question as well? You talked a lot about on-device settings, but how often is if one site differs from another and what those devices are going to be doing, does that get overlooked typically, or is that something you find you have to bring up in order to make sure it happens?
So that is something that I will always bring up, that I will always suggest to my customers. And, and some of them would need a different configuration for different sites, because, for instance, the Wi-Fi credentials might be different, or things like that. But I would say for the most part, that's not the case. And at least in my experience, typically from site to site, all the basic settings are the same. But what I do always recommend is that for different job functions. So for instance, just the applications that you show on the screen would be different for a nurse versus somebody that's in supply chain versus somebody that's in transport. And, so not everybody needs access to every application. And by having it on there, just, gives people more opportunity to get things in a state of disarray. So I always, suggest that we take the devices that are going to be used in different areas and actually have configurations specific to those areas.
Is this the point in the process typically where, you mentioned the different user groups, um, supply chain versus a frontline clinician, for example? Is this the point in the process where you make sure that devices are getting in their hands, or at least their persona, for lack of a better term, their user persona is being represented in the room in terms of the meetings and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where we would want to start building a few devices and start playing with those and start sharing those with the other team members, whether it be clinical or informatics, or supply chain, wherever this particular project happens to be rolling out. And so yeah, so that's where we would want to start doing that. And actually, just letting people just kind of play around with the devices and give us their feedback on it at this stage.
It makes sense.
One of the thing that came up was the term first article, which I know I'm pretty familiar with this, but can you talk about what you think, how you use the definition first article and what that looks like as you hand that off, or as a VAR or a partner hands it off to a customer?
Absolutely. So that's exactly where, once we've been making all these tweaks and we've been locking down the device and we've been sharing that with people to get their feedback. And then once we've got all that hardened to where, we think it's going to be the final configuration that we're going to roll out, then, that's where we would identify our first article, being that configuration.
And that's, I guess that the phrase I've always seen it as, the first article is the thing that you're on day one, you're putting in front of the pilot users and getting feedback on. And it's definitely not the last article, but it's
Exactly.
it is the first thing that goes in their hands. It's the one it's been signed off and approved by your IT and operations stakeholders before it gets in the hand of the clinicians and nurses, right?
Right. It's the one that we think is going to be the final article, but it's probably not, to your point. That's what the pilot's all about, right? Is we actually want to have to make changes during the pilot. We want for people to find stuff.
Yeah,
And
which that's a good segue. I think that the third area you guys covered is pilot and readiness, which is getting devices into pilot and running a pilot for long enough but not too long, and collecting data and feedback. But I guess when you think about a pilot, what is your thoughts around the entry criteria for a pilot, and then what makes what do you do along the way, and then what is the exit criteria for a pilot?
Yeah, absolutely. So all the things that you want to identify in that pilot. I mean, first of all, it's don't let the pilot be too big and don't let it go too long. So 30 days, 60 days is probably the longest that I would ever recommend, and keeping it as confined as possible. So again, in a hospital, that may be a nursing unit. So maybe it's 10 devices that are going to be used by, 40 or 50 nurses over the life of the pilot. But you want to identify, exactly what we are expecting of this from all the different stakeholders. And so, we want to be getting feedback from the nurses who are using the devices. We certainly want to be getting feedback from, clinicians and other people during that pilot stage. And so, again, just identifying what everybody's responsibility is going to be during that pilot. And then, and certainly we want to identify methods for making changes during the pilot. So, whenever somebody does come back and identifies, something that we need to change, again, maybe it's a setting or whatever. Maybe it's because of the displays going dark too soon and they want the display to stay on for 10 minutes. Just those sorts of things is, then how are we going to actually make those changes during the pilot, and then identify whether or not that's the setting that we do want, because we don't want things getting changed and then rolling out into production later just because we forgot to put them back. So again, the project manager would help a lot with that, and and then identifying what would be successful criteria also. So when we get to the end, what can we look at to decide whether or not this was, a successful pilot and we're ready to move on, or do we need to go back and step back a whole step and reevaluate and plan for another pilot?
One of the
Makes
things
sense.
that, yeah, one of the things that stood out to me, on you guys had talked about this and covered it in depth, and it definitely rang true, was around the readiness piece. And I can't remember if it was Hector or you that called this out, but when you put a bunch of devices on a network, it's a lot different than having a device in a lab.
Mhm.
And network readiness is something that a lot of people overlook. Can you talk about, when you think about the infrastructure side of the network and these devices, multiple devices being in a site, things to look out for, things that you learned along the way?
Sure. So again, that is just I mean, to your point about just the network readiness, that is always a key because, as we've been doing the testing and you've got, one or two or five devices sitting on the desk in IT and you're working on it, that's one thing. But then whenever I've got 25 nurses in a huddle or I've got 300 nurses in the cafeteria at lunchtime and everybody has their device in their pocket, what is that doing to my network? What if like a code blue goes out so that everybody's getting a notification at the same time? And so those are the things that certainly need to be considered is, putting that stress on the various parts of the system, not only the network, but then also applications. Are the servers, are the routers going to be able to handle the data that's going to be going through them? And so those are certainly all things that we want to be thinking about and testing as much as possible during this pilot stage. And, and another thing I didn't mention before is about doing multi-stage pilots, which I've always thought is a really good idea too, that you pick 2 or 3 different areas within the hospital, and then we're going to go into, maybe like the ICU, which is typically a pretty quiet, pretty slow-paced department. So maybe we want to start there because that's going to give us an opportunity to really spend time with the nurses, getting feedback, to follow them as they're actually rounding, things like that, watching their workflows. And then, maybe phase 2, once that one was successful, we move into like the emergency department where things are a lot crazier. And it's not always as easy to get nurses to sit down and talk with you because when they get a chance to take a break, they want to take a break. So it's, but again, it gives you an opportunity to see, everything in a different use case in a little bit different environment as you move through the pilot. So just keeping the pilot to one area is not always, I think, a great idea. I like to see multi-phase pilots.
I think you bring up an excellent point there, Tony. I almost look at that as like stress testing the pilot in different scenarios, but learning, from the lower risk scenario first before you try to move on from there.
Right.
One of the things you talked about too that I think is super important is defining the success criteria for a pilot. And I'm curious how you manage that with changes that occur in the pilot or things that you learn in the pilot that maybe aren't working, and then how to make sure the team stays focused on the fact that the pilot is something where we're supposed to learn and determine what success looks like based on what we define, as opposed to everything going 100% correct. Is there a way to keep the team on track with that mindset or stay positive? Just because something isn't working as anticipated doesn't mean it's broken. It just means we learned something.
Correct. Right. And it's also important to remember, so we have the success criteria of why are we even doing this project, right? What did we want to get out of it? Is it to put, mobility into the nurses' workflow so that they're not having to wheel around a WOW or use the computer in the room with their back to the patient? Now we're putting this Android device in their hands so they have more FaceTime with their patient and still all the capabilities. Is that the reason for this? Or is there some other, just primary reason for this whole project? And so that's certainly one of the things that we want to keep in mind. And again, I would hope that the project manager and the project owner are, staying very aware of that. But then there's also the other things that come along, again, with having this Android device that you're putting out there that now also have to be the success criteria of, is it locked down enough that the devices aren't getting, just put into various unusable states, but then it's not locked down so much that the nurses can't use it, right? So whoever it is, it's whatever department it is going to be using the device. And so it's, there's that balance that you have to work out. And to me, that is one of the success criteria as well is, are people happy with it? Are they being able to use it for what they're supposed to use it for, but then we're not having them come back broken all the time and IT's having to deal with them and reconfigure them. So, you certainly want to work that balance. And that is absolutely, to me, part of the success criteria.
Yeah, so it's the clinical mobility is supposed to make the work easier for the practitioner to perform. Not we're trying to make it smoother, not harder, right?
Exactly. Well, and again, one of the other things that I've learned in my time in healthcare is nurses didn't go to nursing school to become technologists for the
Right.
most part. Nurses went to nursing school because they want to take care of patients. They want to help people get better. They want to spend time with their patients. They don't want to spend time working on a computer. They're going to use the computer as a tool just like they would use any other tool. And if it's not going to be easy for them, if it's not going to do what they need it to do, then they just won't use it. It will be a tool that just, sits over on the counter in the nurse's station.
Yep.
So, it's really important that we find that balance to all those things to make the nurses happy. And then certainly when you start talking about supply chain and transport and areas like that, I mean, that's just a different kind of user. So we still have those same things that we want to balance for that other user persona in that case.
I like that. I think it's really good insights.
Um, really thinking about the post pilot. So, like Tony was saying, you've gotten through the pilot. You've maybe had a couple iterations of your first article, which second, third, fourth article, and got to the point where you have, I think, what we refer to as a golden image. You have this tested, proven setup for your various departments that you want to roll out to. From there, you go into deployment, which seems easy. Just ship 20,000 devices. People will turn them on. It should work. Um, Not necessarily the case. I feel like most deployments, you want to do phase deployments. You want to have rollback, the ability to back up. You have certain supports. You have to start training your help desk. I guess, Tony, as you think about the deployment, what are the most important pieces that come to mind or that you've seen, especially in the hospital environment for pushing and deploying once you've gotten through pilot and have your golden image?
I think you just hit on a lot of them. So certainly training, training, training. It's again, the deployments that I've seen that have not been successful or not very successful are the ones where they just gave the devices to the users. Here you go. And you really can't do that. You've got to actually, this is how you turn it on. This is how you log into it. This is how you get into the application. This is how you can change the volume. Just all those, and as just remedial as that seems, because we all have phones and we're all very used to those things, it's not necessarily always the case. There are people in the hospitals that need that training, and so if they don't, then maybe they just aren't paying attention to you. But certainly offering that and making sure that your training staff is available. And again, you mentioned the help desk. You got to make sure that the help desk is ready on day one. Actually, day -1, you want your help desk ready, because whenever you give people the devices, you're going to start getting those phone calls. You need to have your RMA process in place because devices will break. Sometimes people get into emergency situations and they will use it as a weapon, and then it needs to go back and get the screen fixed on it again or whatever. So we need to have all those things in place on day one of deployment, and not be putting those processes together after the fact. And again, the phase deployment, as you mentioned, I think is very critical to do it just one area at a time, so that if we do find something that we missed in the pilot, if we need to go back and make changes, I don't want to have to go back and make changes to all 2,500 devices that we're rolling out. I'd really rather just do the 100 that we've rolled out so far. So it's, the opportunity to just go department by department and come across any more, things that we need to work on, that we need to modify, and have the ability to just pause and take care of that as we go without being, affecting the entire enterprise.
And Tony, we talked, in the pilot phase around having success criteria. Um, Similarly, in a deployment phase of a project, after deployment, what constitutes a successful or healthy rollout versus one where maybe you're just not hearing people complain? And so it's quiet, but so you assume everything's good, but when you dig in, it's actually not. Is there a similar set of success criteria for the deployment that you need to have in addition to, the one you might have for the pilot?
So I absolutely think, I mean, any project should have an ROI. So, whoever the project owner is should be, monitoring the project to see if it's achieving its goals and, within budget and everything else. So that's certainly success criteria going through the deployment and post deployment. But then I think that one of the other, certainly you should, I don't know if everybody defines success criteria during deployment. Probably they should. But it is very similar to the pilot, and you want to have happy users. You want to have users that, to your point, it's just because they're not complaining because things are quiet. Sometimes they don't complain because they're just so mad and they're not using them, whatever it is that we, put out there. And so everything's just in a drawer somewhere, and we think that everybody's happy because they're not opening, help desk tickets. But the fact is that we just spent all this money and all this, team effort, and nothing's actually being used. So that's where we get into rounding, and that's where IT, informatics, senior leadership should be going and talking to the users and literally just stopping them in their shift and asking them, how are things going? Are you happy with this? Are you unhappy with it? Anything you think that we should change on it? And again, in my successful deployments, I see that. I see that IT and informatics and nursing leadership are out there visiting with the nurses, or that if it's a supply chain, that the supply chain management is actually staying in touch with IT and with the users. And it's a constant thing and that doesn't end. Just because we're through the pilot or we're through deployment, that shouldn't end, because we can always find places to improve and make changes.
So that's a
Yeah,
good
I think,
segue
yeah.
into like I think the fifth area you guys covered in your presentation, which is actually the post deployment support. And the thing that stood out to me the most was, I think you sort of just touched on it here, but I think you framed it as the 28 days later, making sure you're inspecting and continuing to iterate with your expectations. And then the other one was analytics, actually having analytics off the devices like usage, logins, app, a lot of those pieces. I guess for you, when you think of I call it day two, but you've rolled out, you've gotten your 10,000 devices out the door. What do those next 4 months for post deployment support look like when you guys are working with clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where, and certainly we offer some tools. Your MDM is going to have some functionality, just for monitoring the devices. And so, for instance, we have a utility called Visibility IQ that will let you go in and actually look at the utilization of your devices. And so you can see department by department, site by site, how many devices are being used versus how many are deployed there. So, for instance, do I have a department that has 80 devices in it, but only 15 are ever in use at a time? And then I have another department that has 20 devices and all 20 are always in use. Maybe I need to be moving things around. Maybe we didn't, deploy them in the right numbers to the right departments. So those are things that you can do. And with that same tool, and certainly with the MDM, you can do it as well, is look to see, when was the last time, devices checked in? Did I deploy 1,000 devices and two of them haven't checked in the last, 30 days? Where are those? It's, what are, did they walk away? Were they stolen? Or they just turned off at a desk? But again, monitoring those things and not waiting 30 days, right? So monitoring those things, on day two and day five, and just, keeping up with those trends, so that you can, research and identify those issues as they come up. And so, that's, I guess, what I would consider asset tracking and utilization. And then certainly there's other ways that we can monitor, like the application and the system performance, network performance, things like that. So there's, all sorts of tools out there, some from Zebra, some from other providers, for, just monitoring the system after the fact and making sure that things are being utilized, to a high efficiency.
That makes a ton of sense.
Lee, for you, I know you've done a lot of these large deployments. Are there things that stand out to you, whether it's healthcare, even some of the other industries, in regards to the day two supports and just lessons learned you've had, 3 months on after you've gotten devices out the door?
I think something I'd like to echo is actually something that Tony brought up is, um, I think with technology, there can be uh, an inclination to, once something is deployed and working, let's say for 90 days, to assume that you're done and think that, like, well, that's finished. We can now do something else and that will just continue to run in perpetuity. But to Tony's point, this is a constant thing that you have to monitor and keep updates with. So from that perspective, I think you made one of my favorite things that you said, Tony, was That's where rounding comes in. That's where getting on the floor and talking to those end users and actually understanding what problems or issues they may be having or what successes they're having on those devices. The good thing is, the device itself can be changed in terms of the configuration and how the users are interacting with it, and you can always improve on it. So it's a living, breathing thing, and I think that's one thing that a lot of people tend to lose perspective on is just, this is done. I'm now going to move on to redoing all the access points in the building, or changing all my door locks, because it comes in the same department. But you really need to be thinking of perpetual improvement in this.
Absolutely. I just one example of that. One of my customers, they had our phone app was on their Zebra device, and after we had done deployment, they came back and they wanted to put some speed dial numbers on the main screen, just on the regular phone screen when you open the app. And so we did that for them. We gave them the configuration to put the speed dial numbers on there. But then, like, the pharmacy started getting 400 phone calls a day from people just accidentally hitting the button. And so then they came back and they said, well, can we put them in a folder somewhere? And so we did that. So we put a folder on the main screen to put the speed dials in that. So again, that's the kind of thing, we got the feedback that we want you to add this feature, that we did. And then we got, oh, this isn't really working the way we want. And so we went back and changed it again. And now they're really happy. Now they love how it works. So
yeah, I would say it's just that, Brett, for me, the biggest thing is now that it's out, you can always improve on it. You can always change it. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's something you're always going to have to pay attention to.
Correct. And again, one of my comments to IT managers is always, you didn't put all those Windows workstations out there and just walk away from those. And so again, this isn't just a phone. You're putting a device with an operating system on it, and it has to be managed just like all your Windows workstations have to be managed. And you will have to manage software and versions of apps and versions of operating system and patches and all those things that, it's not any different. And so IT needs to commit to having those resources up front.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there is that disconnect there. When people are like, well, there's the phone, it can do it all. And then you're like, well, actually you do have to monitor and manage these things.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. And so let's cover the 5 areas. And then, Tony, I really appreciate that presentation, and you also just chatting with us today about it. And I'll reiterate this. I know I've said this to people all the time. One of the biggest advantages I see around working with Zebra is their sales engineering teams across all their different divisions, like Tony's team, where if you need help, if you need guidance, years and years of experience doing this mobility, you guys bring a wealth of knowledge, and it's just awesome. So if you're out there looking for devices, Zebra has some incredible sales engineers that can help you out and support you in that. So definitely reach out to Tony and his compatriots across different divisions, depending who you're working with. But just want to say I really appreciate it. Tony, I know you guys, Zebra.com is y'all's website, and in the healthcare organization, I think most folks know how to get in touch with their Zebra sales rep or their SE through their reseller. Anything else you need to call out or wanted to talk about for Zebra?
No, I think that you hit it. So yes, so zebra.com is our website. Certainly you can get a hold of us through that. And yes, I really appreciate this opportunity with you guys. Really enjoyed working with Blue Pledge.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us today. And as always, if anyone has any questions for Blue Fletch, you can reach out to us at bluefletch.com. Or if you have questions for Tony and his team, take a look at zebra.com. Some great devices, great engineering. And Lee and Tony, thanks for joining me today on this.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for tuning into the Frontline Mobility Edge. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe for more content every month. If you'd like to learn more about Blue Fletch, check out the link in the description or visit us at bluefletch.com. See you next time.